Donalda, Wright, thank you very much for joining us. You live in Ontario, Canada, and your son and I were students together at the University of Ottawa some decades back. It's
Quite
hard
a
to
while
believe.
back.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's been that long. And we're talking at a time of pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and the way I learned just a little bit about you was that you said to your son Don that you've having lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War. You've seen tough times before, and we'll get through this as well. So as soon as I heard that Don's mom had a memory of the Great Depression and the Second World War, I wanted to talk with you just to hear your memories of that time. And just as a way of getting started, when you hear the phrase Second World War, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, there were several incidents in my own life, but I think probably like everyone else, you think of the desperate situation there was in Europe. I mean, you can't help but have a great deal of sympathy for what went on, in the European countries leading up to the war and Hitler's invasion, and then finally of Poland, and that was when England went into the war. And of course, you see, Canada being part of the Commonwealth, it was expected that almost immediately we entered the war as well.
Right.
And we were not, in fact, when I was in school, this was when I was in elementary school, actually.
Yeah.
You couldn't be a Canadian citizen. You were a British subject, and then of whatever descent your father happened to have been. No matter when they came. I mean, my father's grandfather came to Canada originally from Germany, but I had to be a British subject of German descent. And that was kind of interesting because sometimes, if other children knew that, they think, oh, well, you're part of the enemy, But I remember that then actually in 1947, we could become Canadian citizens. So that's an important
After
date.
the war.
After
Right.
the war.
Well, and World War II is sort of an important transition, isn't it, for Canada in terms of the development of Canadian identity? And
I think too, because we sent so many troops right away.
right.
And that was part of forming our identity, actually, was and the First World War, of course, too. But
right,
but when the Second World War came, I think that we were ready almost to become our own country and to be.
Well, we can mention some things in relation to that. And one of the reasons I'm so glad to talk with you and hear from you is, well, as you know, Americans are famous for some things, but they're not famous for knowing very much about Canada.
That's true. We seem to know a lot about the United States.
Right. Yeah. And so I don't think most Americans really have any idea of the tremendous contribution Canada made to that war.
Well, I have no idea of the number of military personnel that were lost, but it was very significant, particularly at DDay when we went in. And actually, you see, Canadians were more involved in the European war, whereas the Americans, although they were also in Europe, were in the South Pacific.
Yes, that's right. So we're touching on a number of themes that I have in mind, and so we'll work through these things. You mentioned Hitler's invasion of Poland. So this is September 1939. Britain at that point then does declare war along with France. Do you remember hearing on the radio the addresses of Winston Churchill?
Oh, yes. I mean, I couldn't remember word for word, but I remember. Sure. Well, actually, it was before Churchill, it was Chamberlain that originally was the Prime Minister of England that was trying to negotiate peace with Hitler.
Right.
And then it deteriorated, and Hitler kept going. The Germans kept going into one country, then another country, another country. But I think Poland was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, that's right.
He actually declared war when Britain declared war, and very shortly after that, I don't know how long, but it was probably weeks or months. Then Canada went into the war, and
well, I think even days. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I think. Anyway, I would say probably around a couple of weeks, if that would be the maximum. But
sure, yeah.
I don't know the dates.
Yeah.
It was 1939 anyway, and
right. Yeah.
over the summer we watched it. Well, of course we didn't watch it. We listened to it.
Right.
In those days, you had a radio.
Right.
Not have television.
Right, exactly.
And you'd sit by, I remember my mother was very interested in it, and we would sit by the radio and listen to what was happening. And I remember her being very worried about the fact that there might be a war and that perhaps my father might have to go. I mean, all these kinds of things enter her mind.
You were a teenager at the time.
At that point, I think I was 11.
Okay, so not quite a teenager then.
Mm-hmm.
So when the war begins, then you're kind of at that stage of life where you're gaining a sense of what's going on in the world, but it's probably not. The significance of it isn't really sinking in. Do the image we have now when we hear some of these speeches from Churchill, I'm thinking especially 1940, when we get into 1940, we have the sense of a leader who actually is speaking in a very placid way, but there's tremendous power in what he says. And we have the idea that, the country of Britain is being galvanized, and fortified by these speeches from 1940. Do you have any recollection of that as well, of Canadians also feeling galvanized by, some of these strong speeches from Winston Churchill, especially in 1940?
Yeah, the one I remember most clearly, and it was later, I don't, probably be maybe a little later than 40, maybe 41, but when he said that we will meet them on the beaches, we will meet them.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And that England would not be ever be defeated. And, that this was, that England was, up to the challenge, if you will.
Yeah.
And that each person was. And and of course at that time, we were almost led to believe that it could happen, that the Germans, they'd gone right to France, and then France, of course, is on the other side of the English Channel, that it could have been invaded, and that was very scary for all of us.
Sure, yeah.
And I think the interesting thing was that I can remember in school singing a song called "There'll Always Be an England." I don't know whether you know that one or not, or if you've ever heard it, but we used to, in the morning, we would have assembly, and that was one of the songs that we would sing. And it was so interesting because I doubt that anybody in the singing it had ever been to England, but this idea of that we were part of England. And I can remember singing that song so clearly, and we all would be, just I don't know, very thoughtful and almost prayerful about this. That England, we really have to stand up. England will be free if England means as much to you as England means to me. It was. That's one memory I have of school, actually. was singing that song in assembly in the morning.
Sure. Did the war here in the States, people who lived through the war, and again, you're in late childhood when the war begins, and then you're moving into your teens as the war progresses. People here in the States say that when the war was going on, that kind of the war pervaded everything, that everybody was involved in one way or another. The 5-year-old kid is, who would have had 3 lollipops a week before, now just has 1 because we need to ration sugar.
That's right.
The 11-year-old is going door to door collecting metal, for the war effort. Was it like that in Canada too? I mean, did the war just kind of pervade everything?
Well, yes, because we had food rationing.
Yeah.
First of all, it was sugar, tea, and coffee because those were imported. And so there was quite a lack of supply. And so then they added butter shortly, a few months later. Then eventually meat was rationed as well. And that's kind of interesting because you were allowed 2 pounds of meat per person per week. You had these coupons. And
right.
We were just coming out of the Depression. Nobody could have afforded to have that much meat.
Oh, really? So in that respect, it was almost a bonanza.
Yeah, and then, but there were some families, of course, with older children, like teenage girls and boys that, like 17, 18-year-olds that could use it. And you'd think, well, maybe I can share my coupons, but you couldn't because the coupons were in a book. The book had your name on the front and your address and I think phone number too. I can't remember that, but
yeah.
And of course, in those days too, you shopped in your local neighborhood, and so you knew that the storekeepers knew you.
Oh yeah.
And so if you went to buy meat at your meats, like there were no supermarkets.
Yeah.
In Canada, in Toronto anyway, and I don't think even in those days anywhere there were the big supermarkets.
No.
So you had your grocer, you had your vegetable person, you had your meat store, and so they would know you, and so you wouldn't.
Yeah.
If
you tried to get around the rules, I know here in the States, if you tried to get around the rules, somebody would say, what, do you want Germany to win the war or something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of social pressure.
And then they changed it a little bit so that, because you had to use, if you used your coupon, you had to take, if you 2 pounds, even if you only wanted 1 pound, you had to use the whole coupon. And of course, you see, your refrigerator didn't have a freezer.
Right. Yeah.
So you couldn't buy a lot of meat or anything and freeze it.
This kind of stuff, as inconvenient as it could be, and people feeling like maybe they're being micromanaged to one extent or another, but in your recollection, I mean, was this just something that people were willing to go along with, understanding that it was part of the war effort?
Yeah, I don't recall anybody complaining.
Yeah.
This was the way it was. And also we were always reminded, you've got so much more than they have in England. In England, they were really rationed to what they, the meat and the food.
So when Canada got into the war in 1939, of course, a lot of Americans, we didn't want anything to do with it. The America First Committee, or the American First Group was very strong.
And wasn't in your legislation? Didn't you have an act of
neutrality
that said you could not get involved until you were attacked?
That's right. So we had neutrality laws, and Winston Churchill very cleverly is working on President Roosevelt to get more assistance to the British and the other allies, and the U.S. is, I think, even before the United States formally gets into the war, is in an informal war, with an undeclared war with Germany at sea. But of course, the United States comes into the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Harbor, yes.
From the American point of view, then Pearl Harbor is this huge event. From the view of Canada, what does Pearl Harbor look like? By this point now, you're in your early teens, maybe 13, something like that. So again, I wouldn't anticipate that you'll have deeply informed memories about it, but just what did that event, of course, huge in the United States. What impact do you remember that event having north of the border in Canada, the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, I think we were all very stunned by it. It was, unbelievable almost that could happen because it was I don't think there was any warning. Now, maybe there was, but certainly we hadn't heard of any warning like that
Yeah.
Japan was going to attack. We were all very stunned. I think probably as well we realized that then the United States would be coming into the war.
Yeah.
So
Sure. In that respect, I think Churchill, I forget the exact context, but I think, Churchill, at least privately, said that Pearl Harbor was a terrible thing, but also a really great thing because now it means the U.S. is going to come into the war.
A real turning point, really.
Yeah.
Having the United States involved, because they also you also went to Europe. I mean, there were many military that went to Europe, but more, I think, I'm not sure of numbers, but it seemed that we heard more about what was happening in Guam and what have you. In the Pacific.
Yeah.
And when the prisoners were taken, we had heard a lot about what was happening to them, and
the prisoners of the Japanese in the Pacific. Yeah.
When Japanese took the prisoners.
Especially in the Philippines. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes, and I think Guam was another one, and
the Japanese also invaded Guam, took Guam, and now you mentioned earlier, you kind of suggested earlier that again we're kind of comparing the American and the Canadian experience. When Americans think about World War II, there really are kind of two separate wars. There's the war against Germany, which of course involves the Italians early, and then there's the war against Japan. When you think of the Second World War, do you think primarily of Europe, right? It's not so much a Pacific war.
I think yes, I would say that's true because we went Germany and Italy as well was
right.
Because we had quite a few Italian people in Canada even before the war. I mean, the massive immigration of Italians came in the 50s, but we did have a significant Italian community as well as the German community, of course, had been there for 4 or 5 generations. I mean, they've been there for a very long time. But I think you're right. I think that we certainly heard about what was happening and also in those days, of course, there wasn't as much visual of what was going on. But if you went to the movies, if you went to the theater, there'd be a newscast along with the feature, and that's where we would see what was happening. And we would see quite a bit actually of South Pacific because a lot of the film was taken, of course, by the American newspaper. And it seemed that, and we also got it from Europe, of course.
Sure.
So we did know what was going on. In the South Pacific. But I think most of us had. I didn't have a brother, so I didn't have anyone in the war, but a couple of cousins and a couple of very good friends. One in particular, but they were in the European.
They're all in, So there were Canadians involved in the Pacific, but I think relatively it's a pretty small number compared to. Europe. You just mentioned that you had cousins and friends who did go to the war. Did they all make it home?
Yes, they did. But one very good friend, actually, he had been my swimming teacher at one point, and then the families got to be quite good friends. And he was he'd been in many swimming races and won a lot of medals and what have you, and cups, and he joined the Navy, and he was on a ship called the Athabascan, the HMCS Athabascan, and it was a tribal destroyer. And there were, I think, 3 of them, but at any rate, they were not necessarily attacking ships, although they would, if necessary. But they would accompany a convoy across the ocean and protect. They were protectors, really, of the other of a large convoy. But at any rate, the Athabascan was torpedoed in the English Channel, and I think there were quite a few of them on that ship that were killed, and several were taken prisoner by the German ship that happened to have torpedoed them. Yeah. But some of them got away. A few got away, and he was one of the ones that was able to get to a British ship to be or wait. I don't know how. He didn't talk very much about it, but whether he was on a raft or whatever, I don't know. But at any rate, he was picked up, and of course, all his mother had heard was that his ship had been sunk and how many had been killed. And of course, she and my mother were very close, and they were having these conversations. Well, then about, I guess maybe a day or 2 later, she got a wire from George, and George Quigley was his name, got a wire from him, and it said, that he said, "I am safe, but no cups for this swim, though." and we all thought that was, kind of, that was his way of saying that, we made it. He wasn't injured, and so he stayed in the Navy to the end of the war.
He cycled back into the fight.
Yeah,
I've heard stories of fighter pilots shot down, picked out of the water, and put on another plane the next day, and out they go.
Yeah.
So one of the events that Americans, when they think about World War II and they read about World War II, they tend to focus on the American contribution to World War II. One of the things that we don't know, that we don't hear much about down here, is the Dieppe Raid, the Dieppe Raid of 1942. Do you have any recollections? Of course, because this involved primarily Canadians, and it was a disaster in terms of the casualties. Do you have any recollections of hearing about that event, the Dieppe Raid? What do you remember about that?
Well, I think we were all stunned, and it was such a tragedy because somehow the enemy had found out that I mean, in retrospect, this was what happened, that they had found out that this was that they were going to try to invade at Dieppe, and they were waiting for them almost.
The Germans were, yeah.
Yes. And so it was just such a tragedy because it was almost suicide that they were going into. I mean, it was, and I think many of us were very, very concerned about that. How could this happen?
What are your recollections of D-Day? Of course, on D-Day, the U.S. has 2 beaches, Britain has 2 beaches, and Canada has a beach of its own there.
Yeah.
Beach. D-Day, of course, is a huge event.
Oh, yeah.
In the States, I imagine the same as in Canada. What are your recollections of D-Day?
Well, there again, I think probably my most vivid recollections would be what I saw when I went to the movies and saw some of the actual
The
movie
film.
of this happening. It was almost, I don't know how they ever took the films. Actually, it was, that was quite a quite a feat. I think that they were able to do that. But watching it, and then you can watch as they two soldiers will be going in, and one will be shot down and the other one will get through, and
Mm.
it was kind of terrifying, as a young person to see this. It was, you felt so helpless almost, that uh, why is this happening? At least that was my recollection, that we knew that eventually it had to happen. I mean, we had to invade.
This invasion of France, yeah.
uh, um, but the fact that it was happening was kind of terrifying, because so
Mm.
many people were killed, so many of the boys were killed. And but then, as the weeks and months went by, and they were able to get in and uh, um, uh, take back, the countries one by one. And
Mhm.
uh, you watched it very, very closely. That was, every day. In fact, every day you listened to, the first thing in the morning you did was listen to the radio and see what had happened the night before or the
Wow.
day before. And that was true all during the war. With the bombing, you'd hear in the morning that the Allied forces perhaps had been bombing in Cologne or Berlin or something, and
Wow.
and
Yeah.
then you'd hear that London had been bombed, and Coventry. It was, um,
And you remember being at home and listening to these reports of,
yeah, that was sort of what you did first thing in the morning, was to find out what had happened
yeah,
overnight. I mean, it was different time zone, but there again, you see,
yeah,
it was. I,
yeah.
I don't think, actually, I don't think we had 24-hour radio. I
No,
think
I don't think
I,
so.
I think at midnight probably they closed down the station and then opened it at 6 in the morning or something. Uh,
You remember hearing the reports, as we move closer to the end of the war. Do you remember hearing reports of the very important role the Canadian forces played in liberating the Netherlands? And,
yes,
yeah,
yeah.
what do you recall about that? Anything stick out in your mind about that?
Well, I think just the fact that it was Canadians there, and of course, you see, I guess the other side of the coin was we had their queen in Canada.
Yeah,
We gave the royal family of the Netherlands. They were in Ottawa during
yeah.
the war. In fact, the youngest daughter was born in Canada.
That's right. And let me see, it's a little hazy in my mind. Is this what accounts then for the tradition of the tulips every year in
Yes,
Ottawa,
yes,
as a
and
gift from the Netherlands? Is that right? If I'm not
yes.
mistaken? Yeah.
Not only for them freeing the country with our troops, but also the fact that the Queen was in Canada, and the and her family.
Yeah.
But the tulips in Ottawa in the spring are amazing.
Yeah. And those are gifts. Those are gifts from the Dutch government, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So you've indicated that, from the Canadian point of view, of course, we know there's a war going on in the Pacific, and there are Canadian forces who play roles there. I think, even actually there are Canadian forces who play a role in the war related to the Alaska Aleutian Islands. So Canadians are in the Pacific, but most Canadian work is in Europe. And so VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, comes in May 1945. What are your memories of VE Day?
Well, I remember going to, as I recall, it happened, at least the announcement was made when I was at school. I mean, I wasn't before I went to school. As I recall, but I know that we heard about it at school, and of
Mm.
course, then the school closed for the day. And I remember going with a group of my friends down to City Hall in Toronto
Mm.
because this was where the celebration would be, and it was quite
Mm.
an event. You know, there were
Wow.
bands, and it was quite a crowd. I
Yeah.
mean, Toronto was not a very big city in those days,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Wow.
uh, I can remember doing that. And I remember my mother being upset because she didn't think I should go. She was worried about me,
Oh, is that right?
you know, going down.
Mm.
But there, yeah, like I didn't go alone. It was, I think there were
Sure.
four or
Yeah.
five of us, and but
Yeah.
we were very excited about going down to City Hall and being
Mm.
part of this big celebration.
Celebrating the end of the war.
Yeah, the end of the war in Europe, and then of course,
Being born in Europe. Yeah.
you know, and then I guess it was August that
Mhm.
that the war in the Pacific was
But by the time we get into 45 now, you're 14, I'm guessing 14, 15 in that area there. You've been paying attention to the war. You've been seeing the news clips at the theater. You've been listening on the radio. Of course, the war ends in the Pacific with what brings that to an end is the use of the atomic bombs dropped
yeah.
on Japan. Um, do you remember your response to that or the response of others to the fact that the war is over in the Pacific, but to the use of those weapons at that time? Do you remember any responses at that time?
Yes, I do, and I guess it will always be a question of um, should they have dropped an atomic bomb? I mean,
Mm, yeah,
uh, I mean, there's a two sides of the story. That yes, it did. It brought the war to an end, and it saved a lot of lives in that respect. But on the other hand, you know that
mm,
the consequences of atomic. Well, I don't think anybody really knew how
yeah,
you know at that time.
yeah,
You knew it would be terrible, but uh, I think I had a lot of trouble, and still do, about whether it was wise,
mm.
a wise decision.
And you remember kind of having those feelings at the time. That's
Yeah,
because, uh, post facto, of course, you look back, but you remember having those feelings at the time, feelings of ambivalence at the time. I'm glad the war's done, but kind of what's happened at the same time. Is there something to be concerned about?
yeah. It was uh, the terrible devastation on human life with
Yeah,
the atomic bomb is.
yeah,
I mean, it wasn't just. It was bad enough ordinary bombs, but this was
mm,
something very,
yeah,
very extreme.
sure.
And I can remember, thinking, oh, how could they do that? But then, as I say, there's the two sides to the story,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
uh, I think probably many people have the same feelings that I do about that, uh,
sure.
and still, you still think, you know, um, uh,
Yeah, I think you can understand perfectly well why the decision was made,
yeah,
um, and understand perfectly well why U.S. forces in the Pacific at the time had no ambivalence at all. They were perfectly okay with that decision. But then also look at it and realize, that that introduced into the world a lot of other stuff that is remains problematic. Here in the States, people who lived through that Second World War era, they say that the United States here was never more unified before or since. That the Second World War was that period in time, so far as they remember, when the United States was absolutely unified. Um, when you look back on Canadian history, we haven't talked about your recollections of the Depression. You were a young girl, but you have childhood memories of the Depression, and then all the way up now to now this is your second Prime Minister Trudeau that you remember. As you look at that sweep of Canadian history, do you have the same sense that this war was really a time of tremendous national unity?
Oh, well, I think it was. I don't remember thinking of it in those terms at
Yeah,
that time.
yeah.
Um, uh, I was born in New Brunswick, actually.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we had, friends there. I never really lived there. My
Oh,
parents came back to Toronto
yeah.
when I was quite young, but uh, I had never even traveled across the country. I hadn't seen the country. Um, well, nobody. I mean, you didn't travel in those days the same way you do today,
Yeah.
and uh, I it just never occurred to us that the country wasn't together. I mean, that's sort of a negative way of putting it, but
No, I get it.
the whole of Canada was involved in this,
Yeah.
and certainly British Columbia had the problem with the Japanese people,
Oh, yeah, I wanted to ask you about that.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
And that was something that happened, and in retrospect, it was probably not the thing to do, but
yeah,
it was done.
sure.
And at the time, it was done with. I mean, I'm quite sure that they thought about it, and I guess there were some of them. Some of the Japanese went back to Japan, indeed,
Mm.
but many that didn't were put into camps
The
here. And
internment camps. Yeah, I
yeah,
don't think most Americans know, because this is a major, when we talk about World War II in the States, this is a major part of the story as well, the internment of Japanese in the States. I don't think most Americans know, though, that the U.S. wasn't the only country that did that. Canada also did, and there were other countries as well. Do you remember hearing about that at the time?
oh yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
And at that time, not controversial?
No,
Yeah.
not 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 certainly in my life or in anybody that I knew. Whether there may have been other people that felt differently, and certainly after the fact, yes.
Yeah, you
Uh,
look right. You look
yeah,
back and right,
yeah.
but at the time it just seemed like a reasonable war measure.
We just thought, well, I guess for Canada's safety and perhaps for British Columbia's safety. I mean, there were many Japanese there, and they had boats. A lot of them were fisher people, and
Right, yeah,
so I can understand why the government was saying we
yeah,
have to be careful uh,
right,
because we could be invaded. You could, and uh,
yeah,
I'm sure that wasn't on the minds of the people you know that were moved, but nevertheless, I can understand how the thinking was.
right. You can understand how the thinking gets there. And,
Yeah,
I mean, actually a part of the American story that most Americans don't know, but I think would be relevant to the Canadian situation, is that there was an American town up in Alaska called Dutch Harbor that was bombed. And of course, that's much closer to British Columbia than it is to the continental U.S. And I imagine that, this I think would explain why Canadians were actually involved in operations related to the Alaska Aleutian Islands, just because it's closer to Canada than it is to the continental
yeah,
States. But yeah, so this is one of those events where you can understand how people got there, but looking back on it, it's certainly a regrettable thing. You remember hearing about that at the time.
yeah. Well, I think, and certainly through the years, there's been a great feeling that it was an injustice.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, but at the time, and I think that so often we're inclined to judge uh, now, uh, not realizing what it was like at the time.
exactly. That's one of the hard things about
Yeah, that's
doing
true.
history well, trying to understand things from the point of view of the people on the ground at the time.
Yeah, yeah,
I tell my students that, you know, Canada and the United States are both very self-critical. We spend a lot of time criticizing ourselves, criticizing our history, and that's important. But I tell my students, look, but if there was one moment that we can look back on with a sense, I think, of legitimate pride, putting us, understanding inevitably there are complications, internment being one of them. But, that war represents a time when, young people, I mean, of course you have women working, taking jobs in Canada that are very important to the war industry. You've got Canadian children who are not having as much sugar as they would like to have, things are rationed, et cetera. And the primary goal here, the primary reason Americans and Canadians invade France is not to make a colony of France, it's to liberate France. I think it's to liberate Belgium, it's to liberate the Netherlands, it's to liberate Norway,
Oh, absolutely.
let the Norwegians run Norway, get the Germans out of Norway, etc. When you look back on that period, I mean, do you agree with that there's a lot of stuff in that war that's awful inevitably, and stuff, if we could do it again, we would do it a different way. But on the whole, do you agree, looking back at that war, that is something really for Canadians to be proud of, the really important role they played in liberating, truly liberating millions of people. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Oh, yes. I think that, it was, you knew what, at least I'm quite sure it was true, what we were told, but we were told what was happening in the countries that had been invaded by Germany, and indeed what was happening to the Jewish people, and you couldn't allow that to happen. Although I must say that even Canada refused to let one ship of German Jewish people land, and that to me is one of the saddest things. But that's sort of difficult. But the fact that we value freedom, I think, and we knew that the people that where Germany had invaded didn't have freedom anymore.
Yeah.
You didn't have freedom of thought. You didn't have freedom of movement, and certainly in Canada, although the war was, we knew all of what was going on, we weren't physically allowed to suffer. Really.
Yeah.
We weren't bombed. We weren't torpedoed. I mean, I think that there was a danger that we might have been, because there were submarines coming in even on the East Coast, very close.
I think even down the St. Lawrence, you had a little bit of.
And certainly off Newfoundland. Of course, Newfoundland was not part of Canada then. It was still part of Britain, but nevertheless, this was a danger, probably more than some other things that you knew that because we valued our freedom and the freedom to worship and to be ourselves, and to have some, and having been through the Depression as well, that you could do things. It was possible to do things. You had the freedom to act and to be educated and what have you. And I think that we knew that that if we didn't oppose this, that we could be in the same boat as the European countries.
I might sound a little old-fashioned and maybe even a little sentimental here, but when I think of these 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old Canadian and American guys, jumping off these boats and running, across those beaches on D-Day, I just can't help but feel inspired. And at that time, they didn't know what we know now. I mean, those young men did not know about the death camps. They didn't know about them yet. They're going to find out about them in the months to come, but they don't know about them. They really don't know the significance of the work that they're doing. And of course, a lot of them are drafted and didn't have a whole lot of
Right.
choice about it anyway. But still, I feel very inspired when I think about them and what they accomplished. And I don't, of course, for me, I have no living memory of that. I just read about it and watch documentaries. But you have that memory of hearing about it in real time.
And seeing it on the news,
Seeing it on the
when
news.
they went to the theater,
Yeah, that's right.
seeing these,
Mhm.
and knowing it was happening.
Yeah, it's real. It's not just an interesting movie. It
Yeah.
actually happened.
Yeah.
Let me put you in front of my students, and you've got just a few minutes to tell my students what you think they should know about that time in history, that moment in history. What do you think is important? What should young people today know about this period of history?
Well, I think that it's extremely important that all of us, not just students, because there's some older people that perhaps don't value it as much as they should. Um, the fact that we do have freedom.
Mm,
I think that these young men uh, um, gave their lives
mm,
uh, so that not just the people that they were liberating would be free, but that continually on through generation to generation, we're also free. And,
mm,
and we have the freedom to choose. We can, which had been taken away from millions of people. Uh, and to me, that would be what their main contribution would be, that
mm,
they are um, that they have given their lives so that we can have a fuller life. We can have the freedom to do whatever. Um, well, I mean, I shouldn't say whatever we want to do because some people don't want to do good things just after what's happened in Nova Scotia. But
right.
uh, but that we do have a free society, and that everyone really should be they should realize that people are created equal and
Mm,
with equal opportunity. Of course, we all have different gifts,
sure.
uh, but uh, I think that that's as I say, even coming through the depression, where my father always had a job, so I didn't have to really worry about. We always had we could pay the rent. We couldn't own a house. You didn't have enough money to buy a house, but
Mm,
you had a place to live and you had food. Not a whole lot of food, but you had food,
mm,
and that people learned to cooperate. I think,
mm,
and that's something that hopefully we'll do. And I think that today, with the virus, I think that we're learning that we have to cooperate and live together, and
mm,
even though we have to be apart, that there are certain things that you have to do to make your country, make uh, your own life even safe. That, for instance, like I'm 91 years old, so
mm,
I 92, almost 92. Uh, um, uh, I can't go out. I can go in my backyard. I can't go out.
mm,
Uh, um, and that's
mm.
uh, because there's no theater, there's no meetings, there are
Right.
no church, no, I mean, these things that you're used to doing, even go shopping. Fortunately, I have family that'll do my shopping for me. But I think that we all, have to, if we cooperate, we're going to beat this thing.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
uh, if we don't, then I think we are going to have a lot more problems in the healthcare system.
Mm.
But
Yeah, and you're able to draw on, of course, a very different situation, a very different historical moment, but still a moment when people had to pull together for a common cause, and the common cause in this case was defeating, the Nazi regime, and Canada did also play a role in defeating the Japanese military. That took everybody pulling together and everybody making some kind of contribution. So you're able in this current moment with this, pandemic situation that's going on, you have that historical memory of that time when the country did do that, pulled together and got through this thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh yes, it was. You didn't even think about not not being one country. Even though although in Quebec they didn't want to have conscription, uh,
Right.
that was interesting, uh, uh, but still.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
I thought of that when I talk about national unity. There is always, you kind of have to have that particular conversation about Quebec. That's true. That's
yeah.
true. But we'll let that go for now. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed meeting you on Zoom.
Yeah.